Ladies and gentlemen, you're not here to hear me. You're here to hear Amanda Spielman. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. I'm going to start by saying I am a really big fan of Research Ed. I have spoken at every one of the main conferences in one or other of my previous incarnations, and I've attended a lot of sessions at every event, as well as speaking, which is even better, because I've had some of my lazier assumptions challenged, I've had my thinking tested, and I've had my horizons broadened. And beyond the actual conferences, I've watched the professional discussion that it's generated, sort of rippling through the world of education. And I think this is a wonderful thing and an enormous credit to Tom, to Helene Golden-Ashay, to everybody involved, because so many people put so much time and energy into making it happen. And so I really am glad to be here and talking, though I do have in mind what Tom wrote when he invited me last year, and I looked in my emails to get this. I'll quote him. What could be more refreshing, simple and soothing than delivering a session at a national conference that's both live streamed and sizzling with Twitter, ready to pick up the faintest of stumbles and broadcast it to Zimbabwe instantly? Tom knows how to make you relax. But in my last life at Ofqual, my talks here were about some of the problems and limitations of the measurement of student performance and how we were using research to address them there, which flows rather nicely into my current life at Ofsted, where we're measuring institutions, and along the way also making use of those measures of student performance. So I've called this talk today, Inspection Rocks the Research World, for a couple of reasons. First, because I think Ofsted actually has a lot to contribute to education research, especially because we have so much evidence that we collect in the course of inspection. And also because what we do most definitely shouldn't be disconnected from the wider world of research. In fact, I could just as easily have called this Research Rocks the Inspection World, because we should, and indeed we are and will carry on, be using research to inform what we do. There's got to be a healthy synergy between the two, in fact. We have to work closely with the research world, with academics, research organisations, think tanks, and schools and teachers, to make sure that we're using the best available evidence and using it in the right way. When I started the job a few months ago, I said I wanted Ofsted to be a force for improvement, and research really is fundamental to our new strategy, which we're going to be publishing later this month. And as some of you know, we're hiring a new head of research, building up the function, though alas, I really can't tempt fate by saying any more about that one today. Shame. So I'm going to use this session to set out a bit about what we see as possible purposes for our research, and to set out some of the questions that we think we could and should be exploring, both through inspection activity itself and more generally as an inspectorate through a research function, and to float some very tentative ideas on how we might answer them. So, can I do that? Is that way? Excellent. So, what should be the purposes of research at Ofsted? Well, there are four main research purposes that we've identified. And the first is to give a bird's eye view of the entire education system as it comes together from our inspection evidence. It would be an awful waste if we thought that our job was done when we publish an inspection report. We add value when we aggregate our insights and triangulate it with other research and give really good analysis of what's working well at the national level. It's actually one of my statutory responsibilities to report on standards, and that's got to mean a whole lot more than just counting up numbers of inspection grades. And this year's review of curriculum, it's a thematic review, is an example of a piece of work that's partly aimed at fulfilling this first purpose. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that later. But I will mention now that when I talk to teachers and heads, the Ofsted report that they most frequently mention as having sort of rocked their world is the wasted years, which reported on Key Stage 3, and how those first few years of secondary school are so often desperately underused. That's exactly the kind of bringing together of our evidence that we'll be doing more of. And the second and related purpose is to inform government of how well policies are being implemented and whether they're having an impact. again, our curriculum review is an example of this, but there are plenty of others. And one I'll mention today is that one of the things we're doing this year is looking at how the SEN reforms are working through in practice. And a third and really important purpose is to build the evidence to improve our own inspection research processes and practice. And the first bit of work on this that we published this year was on the consistency of inspector decisions in short inspection conversions. Again, I'm coming back to processes, but I want to say now that one really important point is getting a handle on what kind of reliability we should be achieving. Of course, it's tempting to say that we should be perfectly reliable, as anything else would be completely unfair to schools. But hold on a moment. In the real world, perfect reliability would be almost impossible and certainly undesirable. Why? Well, if we were to make inspection so formulaic that there was a black and white answer to every single situation, then you can see easily that that wouldn't be useful and all sorts of hideous things would happen. And just to take a parallel example from testing, there's only one kind of test that can be marked with sort of perfect or near perfect reliability, which is multiple choice tests. But most people recognise that an assessment system that only used multiple choice testing would probably have some pretty unpalatable consequences for what happened in classrooms. And exactly the same would be true for inspection. The fourth purpose, we should understand the effect that our inspections have both on providers themselves, schools and other kinds of provider, and everybody who uses our reports and judgments. It includes schools themselves, heads, but actually also everybody who works in schools. It includes governors, it includes other bodies responsible for schools, whether they're sort of MATs or local authorities or standalone governing bodies. It includes the other parts of governors, including sort of regional schools commissioners and funding agencies, and of course the parents, who look to Ofsted for reassurance about their children's education, as well as for information to make choices. And the impact isn't just from reports. There's a great deal of professional dialogue during inspection itself, and that's the part that's often most highly valued by schools from the feedback we get. But is it leading to actual improvement? We should test that. And of course, while it isn't quite a research purpose in itself, put at the bottom of this slide, we have to make sure that we use our own and third-party research to make sure that we look at and do the right things in inspection itself. And the next iteration of our common inspection framework will be drawing pretty heavily on both our own and third-party research. So I'm going to talk a bit more about a few of these purposes, starting with the third purpose, because the validity and reliability of our judgments get quite a bit of airtime, and quite rightly and understandably. Are our inspections good enough at measuring what they ought to? The education quality. Because without that, everything else is pretty much in vain. So let's go there. Ooh. But first, validity itself is a surprisingly tricky and slippery concept. Put a definition, one possible definition up here, which is far from perfect. And by the way, the slides will be available on the website, and I think a slightly fuller version with some notes on them. The extent to which our inspections measure the right thing in the right way to produce sufficiently accurate and useful results. There's a number of things in there. What is an inspection? How widely do you view it? Do you see it narrowly as what is prescribed in the handbook, or do you really think about the sort of meta effects of being there, what it prompts? You think about how much you wrap into that side of validity. You have to think about the sort of construct of measurement that you're using, the ways you aggregate, the effective weightings that you're giving to various things, and how you build up. And what is sufficiently accurate and what is useful. There's so much, actually, that is packed into validity, and so to test it, you have to unpack. Now, one of the nice things about being Chief Inspector is that practically everyone has a view about how we should be doing our job. And that's no bad thing. It brings a lot of interesting ideas into the open. I do actually read nearly all the blogs that I spot about Ofsted and inspection, so please keep them coming. It's incredibly interesting. And one blog that approached inspection from a research perspective a few months ago was from Tom Sherrington, which did lay out a magnificently ambitious research programme based mainly on parallel inspections, a sort of extension of the study we'd published. So let's just consider a couple of the ideas that were put forward for testing in this way. The first one was data bias. Are inspection judgments biased by inspectors' prior knowledge of school outcomes? Now, of course, we'd expect a pretty high correlation between our judgments and reported outcomes across the whole school system. If there was no correlation between performance data and inspection outcomes, we really would be worried that one or other wasn't quite right. But it's entirely sensible to think about whether prior knowledge of the data or it's the evidence gathered in inspection itself that makes them so highly correlated. And the proposal that was made was to test both primary and secondary inspections using parallel inspections with 4 separate conditions, with inspectors briefed, using data as now, with no data, and with inflated data and with deflated data, so that they were looking at what they saw in the classroom relative to each of those. But let's consider that in the light of some of what we learnt from our first parallel inspection study. First, there would have to be a lot of extra inspections to get enough data from which to draw valid conclusions. We'd be talking sort of hundreds of inspections to do that properly, and each inspection is a pretty big ticket item. And we can't force schools to take part, so we might well struggle to assemble enough schools to complete the study. And it'd be pretty embarrassing to spend hundreds of thousands and still not have something usable at the end of it. And there are an awful lot of practical difficulties about controlling each inspector's environment. In a normal inspection, the data does get discussed quite a lot. It'd be very hard for inspectors to stay ignorant of the true data for more than a few minutes after they walked through the door. So you might end up really only testing whether inspection planning from data makes a difference. And there might be cheaper and easier ways of testing that. And then think about the difficulty of setting up the inflated and deflated data. We could get our analysts to manufacture some numbers, adjusting the actual data. But then, would you have to brief everybody in the school to talk to the inflated and deflated data as though it were the real data? It would be really difficult for teachers to go through sort of 2 processes at the same time, one of which they were talking real data and one of which they were talking phony data. When you actually think about it, it's pretty difficult. And in that situation, it's hard to imagine you could do that as part of a live inspection. It would have to be totally test, in which case you're doing 2 additional inspections to the main schedule, so even more cost. And the school's still got a live inspection to happen somewhere else, so pretty heavy. And the logistics, we know, would be messy and expensive. Lining all that up, you'd end up with a lot of inefficiently used inspector time. And just to put it in context, our first study, which I think covered 26 inspections, came in, I think, a little under 90,000, including the inspector and the researcher times. Not cheap. But happily, we can look at this really important question about data bias rather differently, and in the first instance, without any expensive trials, because we've got a nice natural experiment. There's a subset of schools, which are mostly new free schools, where we had no exam data when we inspected, and this year, quite a lot of them had results for the first time. We could, therefore, compare them with schools with similar intakes and results and see whether they've received similar judgments at inspection. And that's something we're going to be looking at. Though I fully expect to see a data lab blog on this very quickly. Knowing Becky Allen and Dave Thompson, Monday afternoon I can see Mike Treadaway in the audience up there. It'll happen, won't it? But we might need a bit more time to dig into it really thoroughly and think about what's behind it. And there's another important point here, which is that inspection has changed a lot over the last 20 years. And without going into the pros and cons of changes, We all know that it isn't a ground-up review of every single aspect of a school. Data is used in planning to identify lines of inquiry, and so if we were to inspect without data, it would throw us back into having to fundamentally redesign the entire inspection system to a very different model from what we currently have. So when we do work, we have to think about how we might use the results for different kinds of findings. Another idea, so I've explored data bias quite thoroughly there. Another idea was to test whether inspections on different days would result in the same judgment. And it's a good question. Are inspectors softer on Tuesdays and Thursdays, or at the beginning of term than at the end of term? Now, I talked just now about the work involved in getting a big enough roster of volunteer schools. It was hard work for our previous trial, and while it was billed as double inspections, it actually just meant having 2 inspectors working in parallel in the same school on the same day. So it was still only 1 short inspection day for the schools. And whereas to test this one about different days, you'd have to have 2 inspections on different days, so it really would be doubling the experience from a school's point of view. And hey, that is a burden on the school and workload. And in case you hadn't noticed, I take workload quite seriously. And inevitably, that first inspection would taint the second. I think it's quite unrealistic to think that the effect of the interaction with the school in the first inspection could be completely suspended until after the second. But again, this is something where we can and should be doing more with our own data to identify where problems may exist, and so to see what we should break out and test more thoroughly with full trials. And here, for example, it's probably easier to start with childminders and nursery inspections, because it's a less talked about part of our work, but very big volumes. So lots and lots and lots of inspections completed on every day. We can probably get much more quickly to identifying patterns. Doesn't mean that everything will carry across identically, but some of the things that might affect schools may also show up there more easily. So just with those 2, I've illustrated how parallel inspections really do look a bit, they're a Rolls-Royce tool. It's not that we will never do them again, I'm sure we will, but we have to go several steps further to unpack and think about how we can break what we do down into more parts to really think about. So just to remind us, we think about a bit of an inspection cycle with a number of steps: risk assessment, pre-inspection analysis, the inspection itself with a lot of different activities, the synthesis and judgment, and the reporting. So each of those can be looked at separately, and in some cases we can break them down into several pieces. I'll just talk about a couple of places where we can break inspection down and really test the validity and reliability of what we're doing. And the first is lesson observations. Now, being a very sensitive subject, don't worry, I am not about to suggest that Ofsted is about to start grading individual lessons again. I think most people know the Rob Coe research that's been discussed at ResearchEd in the past and fairly widely, that when 2 untrained observers are asked to judge the quality of a lesson, the likelihood of their judgment agreeing is actually surprisingly low. And even with trained observers, it's far from perfect agreement. So drawing conclusions from a single observation is very risky. Ofsted's absolutely right not to grade individual lessons now, and it would be great if all schools would stop doing it as well. One of the things I hear is that far too often our inspectors get asked by school leaders, yes, but if you did grade lessons, what grade would you give it? Makes me tear my hair out. But still, that doesn't mean that we should throw lesson observation out of the window. It's still a valuable tool, and if it's properly designed around aggregations of well-made observations and with no more inferences drawn from it than it can actually bear. One American study looking at teaching quality in universities has some really interesting findings here. It found that very short, 5-minute judgments made by a number of individual students, when aggregated, had surprisingly high predictive power of the value add that those professors actually achieved. But there are a lot of pieces to that. The number of observers needed, the time they have to do it, and the definition, the precision with which what they were evaluating was defined. So those are the kinds of things that can be explored. And there is evidence from some other studies about the value of aggregated observation. So we're bringing some experts together. We've got a seminar, I think, running on this in November, and that'll be interesting. That'll be one of the things that feeds into our work going forward. And another piece, book scrutiny. Again, something that's used in inspection, something which is very useful when it's used in the right way. It's something, like so many things, you put too much weight on it and it buckles. You use it in the right way, it's really valuable. But there are things we can do to sort of isolate the book scrutiny process, both to test whether inspectors' conclusions are consistent with each other's and whether it gives a valid picture of teaching quality and pupil progress. And there's rather good scanning software now, so the views of other inspectors, remote from the live inspection, could be drawn in to test out the judgments of inspectors on site. And that could be used both in the context of the particular inspection, for training and for research purposes to test the overall reliability and validity. We might get several things from the same bit of scrutiny. So we'll be looking at how we use that scrutiny to evaluate curriculum quality, for example. What could inspectors be looking at to make sure that we have the kind of curriculum that we want across the full range of subjects? But also, how do we make sure that our intention here doesn't get misplaced? As ever, things that we do can so easily start hairs running. We, in all things, I hope, are moving carefully, cautiously, and trying to get the right messages across. Coming on to the bird's eye view, let's talk a bit about the curriculum review that we're doing. As I said at the beginning, the information we collect puts us in such a strong position to comment on what's working. And it's also where we can look at some of the things that we can't necessarily really address in individual inspections. And I'm just going to pick out one example here, which is the performance of groups of pupils. The population of a school is so often too small to be able to draw conclusions about the performance of ethnic minority groups or children with SEN. Yet there's immense pressure to understand how those children are doing. We have to find the right level at which we can properly report on what we see. And our main focus this year is indeed on the curriculum, which is especially important for pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds. I've mentioned before, and I'm not going to let go of the research from Christina Iannelli, which shows that the subjects people study at secondary school makes more contribution to social mobility than the type of school that they attend. But it does seem that whenever you say something from an Ofsted platform, you have to put in so much work again to stop it being misinterpreted. So I want to explain really clearly what we're doing and, just as importantly, not doing on the curriculum. First off, we do have a pretty good national curriculum, which should now be nearing full implementation, and most maintained schools are required to follow it. Most academies say that they choose to follow it. So our starting point is to see how well the national curriculum is translating into practice. And other schools, well, they should be clear about what the alternative is that they're offering, so that inspectors can see whether they're delivering on their promises, as well as how outcomes compare with other schools. But I want to be really clear, this is not about creating an Ofsted prescribed curriculum, but inspection does have to be able to evaluate whether a curriculum's working well, whether or not it fits a particular model. And as I said up here, so it's not an Ofsted improved curriculum, and it's not an introduction of, sort of preferred styles by a back door. And the first round of field work is complete, and later this month I'll be publishing my first commentary, but there'll be plenty more to come beyond that. But I'm going to say now, one issue that comes up time and again really is the lack of expertise in schools now about curriculum thinking, about the content, the design, the implementation. Few schools are thinking really clearly about what should be taught in each subject, how that content is best sequenced, and how it should be fitted together to make each child's whole school experience. And as a result of this, in our survey, we've been finding there isn't really a good shared language at the moment for discussing the curriculum. Even the most commonly used terms often seem to mean different things to different people. So we'll be doing some work on that. And what I said about curriculum, I brought out one of the downsides that I've discovered about my job. Sometimes your words really do get picked up and quoted out of context in ways that make it sound as though you said the opposite. So my focus on curriculum itself and on the substance of education, so important. It's been reported in some places as though I was opposing the EBAC or the use of Progress 8 as a measure. But when I look outside England, I see that virtually every country regards a broad general education to age 15 or 16 as a sort of strong default expectation. And typically that does include history and a foreign language, for example. I really don't see that as oppressive. In fact, completely the reverse. So I'm pretty sceptical when I get told, oh, a curriculum that fits EBAC or Progress 8 isn't right for a lot of our children. I'm convinced that if schools take curriculum seriously, it can be planned in a way that includes really good practical and creative options alongside the academic core. And again, I think in the Times yesterday, my concerns about schools shortening Key Stage 3 to start GCSEs early were reported in a way that made some people think I was criticising the new GCSEs. And I did note, as most people know, the new maths GCSE is quite a lot bigger than the old one. So quite a lot of secondary schools are having to replan Key Stage 3 as well as Key Stage 4 to really do it justice. But that wasn't a criticism of the new maths GCSE. I mean, if anything, the reverse. So I want to say quite explicitly that I really do think the new GCSEs are a good thing, and not just because I was involved with them at Ofqual. First, because I really do think that overall they reflect a better balance of knowledge and skills than their predecessors. And to anybody who's swallowed the rather misleading rhetoric about them being just lists of facts, I'd say go and read the DfE published subject content and assessment objectives. I have, and they aren't. And secondly, restoring linear assessment, it really does better reflect what we know from research about the benefits of repetition and space practice, kinds of things discussed at lots of sessions at these conferences. A cumulative approach to teaching and learning actually helps students consolidate and take their learning forward to the next stage of education. That should benefit weaker students, not harm them. And thirdly, the increased demand. It should help to close what had become too wide a gap between GCSEs and A-levels. It really isn't good to have people start A-level courses and then drop out because the difference in demand is more than they can cope with. Wasn't the aspect of the St Olave's story that was the most discussed, but people's reaction to children falling out of A-level courses is typically pretty strong. And last but not least, I think it's very clear that coursework wasn't fulfilling its intended purpose and had become a huge burden on teachers as well as on students. And a lot of people have told me that. Despite the initial reaction, so many teachers have told me about how glad they are now to be free of that enormous burden. So for me, the new GCSEs really are a big step in the right direction. And similarly for A-levels, a lot of work went into them, beginning with the review, Mark Smith review of their content, and I do think they're a significant step forward. And again, a lot of teachers are telling me now how glad they are to have that time back for teaching. And of course, I'm pretty pleased that the introduction of the new exams went remarkably smoothly this year. And the thanks are, of course, due to all the teachers in this room, all the other teachers who put in so much work to make them go smoothly, to make sure that your students were ready for them. So, from me at least, a giant thank you for that. But I want to come on to the last couple of pieces of this talk. How am I doing for time? 12, 13 minutes. Okay, I think I'm all right, and with a few minutes for questions. Got a little bit less already on the agenda here about understanding our impact, but a couple of things we can talk about. One is we're already doing earlier on I talked about impact being a number of things. The impact comes from what we actually look at during inspection and the sort of knock-on effect of the knowledge of that. That's all set out in the frameworks and handbooks. It comes from the discussions we have with staff during inspections and with governors. It comes from the reports we write, and it comes from the grades we give. All of those are things which a responsible inspectorate will sort of look at routinely and have a sort of programme to keep on testing and checking. We're already doing research with parents on the way we report and testing out some alternative versions of our reports to see if we can get better understanding, better usefulness for parents, really communicate better and more clearly. And we've got another piece of research being scoped up about how our grading structure affects school behaviour. Potentially very interesting, but too early to talk about. But more generally, we really do want to make sure that the way we do all of our work leads to net benefits to individual schools and to the system as a whole. It's got to be a continuing part of being a force for improvement. So lastly, I want to come back just briefly to the work on developing the next framework. We're not rushing into this. We're talking 2019. I think there was an assumption when I started that I'd want to get to a new framework as rapidly as possible. Actually, we're doing a lot of things with inspector training, with resetting the data dashboards that we use for inspection that help take the application of the current framework to the next step. We want to do a really, really good job with the next one. But a really big focus of the review work is inspection reliability itself, and validity and reliability, and measuring the right things and the right way and well enough. And the object we're trying to measure, the education quality, hasn't changed, but we've got to look, as you can see from this talk, at a lot of things to do that well. And of course the how includes the reliability of inspection. If outcomes aren't reliable at the individual inspection level, then they're not useful, so almost by definition they're not valid. And it's not just our research. There's a lot of research already on school effectiveness. So many of the people actually who are presenting at this conference, so many others are working on aspects of things that we should be drawing into our frameworks. It's a big job. Our new research team, I think Amy Finch, who is here from Ofsted. Amy, can I see you anywhere? One of the people to talk to after this session, if you're interested in how we're taking this forward. So we've got to draw things together, we've got to build and use the right things. We've got to bring research that potentially comes from a lot of different sources. There are a lot of research institutions, research aggregators, clearinghouses and so on. To have the best narrative and the best causal explanations from what we're looking for, we really have to bring it all together. And we also have to use expertise in assessment and validity, because education measurement is a skill in its own right. If we don't get sophisticated about that, we'll be missing a whole chunk. So I'm going to rush through slightly because I do want to have a few minutes for questions. I think I might just leap to my ending here. So we really are hoping that we'll be more and more of a research hub over the coming months and bring all of these strands together and find ways like these conferences to present, to talk, to encourage more feedback, more blogs, more lovely blogs, to make sure that we have the broadest possible base of input into what we do. And so please tell me now what you think we should be researching. Talk to Amy after this. Keep the public stuff coming. I'm going to wrap up there, actually, and say, I'm just going to say it is fantastic being at Ofsted. It's fantastic having events like this. Tom, keep them coming, please.
You're the best.
Thank you very much.
Are you going to be the mic man? Thank you. I believe we have man has been kind enough to say that she'll take questions for a few minutes. So, do we have any questions? No? Again?
Quick,
Anyone,
pub.
question? Hands up, please. I'm only taking hands up. You, sir, the man connecting the back.
So we can't hear you, Nick.
Thank you. One aspect of validity you did mention was kind of predictive validity, and whether or not following an inspection, whether that actually makes a prediction about the quality of student educational outcomes that occur. I mean, a recent piece of research kind of implied that actually, Ofsted judgments were kind of fairly accurate historically, perhaps, but didn't necessarily predict kind of short-term or to medium-term changes.
Yeah, I think I'm aware of that. I think that was a piece of research on looking at our nursery inspections. And one of the interesting things there is that there's very much more emphasis. If it's the piece of research I'm thinking of, I read that and thought perhaps it's showing how strong the emphasis in those inspections is on the sort of safety and welfare side of things rather than education outcomes. But that was squarely on my radar as something we should be thinking out and looking more at. Thanks.
Anyone else? Goes there from the front now. Okay, sir.
If I could just quote something from the slides. There was a statement that said, whether the curriculum offer is well designed. That struck me immediately as something that could be interpreted in several ways. How would you go about making sure that for the Ofsted inspection team that there is some repeatability in how that is interpreted?
Well, that's what we're trying to build up by going very carefully doing this curriculum review work, thinking about how to build evidence into inspection. The last thing I want to do is to sort of pronounce on the hoof when we've got this whole sort of process that's designed to take things forward into the new framework. So the last thing I want is inspectors leaping into action saying, I think this is a good curriculum. I don't think that is. And it's why we're starting with the national curriculum, which a huge amount of work went into to design, to make sure it hung together, that it had, I think Tim Oates uses that phrase, curriculum coherence. That is the national starting point. Ofsted shouldn't be setting up an alternative of its own. But we have to look very carefully at how inspectors can get the right balance on curriculum and the intention, what the school is setting out to deliver, as opposed to and what it actually translates into in the classroom and outcomes.
You need a boom.
Hi, Amanda. You were quoted during the week and you said at the beginning of your talk this afternoon that you were very interested in workload.
Yes.
So if you're looking for a research theme for Ofsted, is that one of them? How Ofsted impacts on teacher workload? And as a kind of rejoinder to that, if you find something that isn't all that complimentary about Ofsted, what would you change? Would you be prepared to change?
Two questions there. The first, workload and sort of how workload gets created and carried through is of interest, and it's one of those things where we want to be really cautious about not creating sort of unintended consequences. It's so easy to think you're just tweaking one thing and then to see a whole series of ripples. I think Sean Harford has said that there's going to be a question in the staff questionnaire, which is just a first way of testing whether we can pick up useful information that helps to improve the inspection conversation. It's the first step, not leaping to trying to build something into the criteria for judgment. We have to take slow, careful steps to see what helps get the right balance. Secondly, if I thought, would we change things? Of course we would. And that's the point of setting up all the kinds of research and evaluation, is to give us the basis so that it's not sort of snap judgment. I like this, he likes that, so that we've got a real solid basis for the steps, the iteration we take to make it a sort of logical progression over time to do as much good as we can. It would be terrible to hang on to something out of sort of vanity and hunch. We've got to do the right things. and make sure we're doing our best. You can never have total, perfect insight and say, this is brilliant, this is it. You've always got to have a bit of humility and say, this is the best we know for now. So we are generally helping people by training people to understand that. But you've always got to be open to the future.
Wow, one clap there, that was great. The golf clap. Madam. Yes.
Thank you, and thank you for the madam. I've been hearing, and it could just be rumour, that Ofsted are considering removing the outstanding grade. Would you comment on that? And can I say, as a head teacher, I cannot think of anything better you could do, because I think it's a perverse incentive within the education system that leads to people inflating children's results at the cost of young children's education.
I think I put up on understanding our impact, starting to look at the consequences of our grading structure is one piece of that, and it's a sort of continuing piece of work. It's not plucking out the outstanding grade in its own right and saying, this is a thing. And the whole grading structure has an impact sort of all the way through. So yes, I want us to be looking at and understanding and to be able to be explicit about what we see as the consequences and make sure that what we do has the right effect. So it comes into the wider programme. It's not a thing in its own right.
And we have time for one more.
Somebody, gentleman over here?
Oh, sorry, did you want?
No.
Yeah, please. Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, mine's a quick question. In one of your slides, you mentioned that you were going to look at the impact Ofsted grades had on behaviour in schools, and I was just wondering if that sort of links into or follows on from the Ofsted report on in 2014, Below the Radar. Is that?
I'm sorry, then the wording of the slide is slightly confusing. It's behaviour of schools, the sort of decisions they take about curriculum and qualification offer, and the sort of relationship between grades and that. Sorry, it's not pupil behaviour. Sorry.
Okay.
I'll have to correct that before the slides are posted.
I feel like I should ask a behaviour question, but no, I shan't.
Yeah.
Dying to, though. Actually, we've got time for a micro question.
This one over here?
Thank you, yes. Marginalised outskirts of the room.
Hi, Amanda. I'd be interested if you or if Ofsted believe there's a correlation between level of intake and disadvantaged intake and Ofsted grade?
We've been doing a lot of analysis looking at that, and it's a little bit. Damn, it's something I could have put into this talk that would have been very interesting. It is a much subtler picture than the narrative that's been floating around the last few months. I've been talking about the difference between the overall effectiveness from a child's and a parent's point of view and the quality of leadership and management and what a team is succeeding in doing, and saying that the leadership and management is often the crucial judgment that should help inform any decision that's taken by governors, local authorities, MATs, whatever. And looking at that, we found that for schools in a given category, and Amy will correct me if I get this wrong, but for schools in the requires improvement category, say, high disadvantaged schools are significantly more likely to be rated above that, to be rated good for leadership and management than less disadvantaged schools. So we think we've got some evidence that actually the inspection model does discriminate and recognise where leadership teams are doing as good a job as they can be expected to do in tough circumstances. But we need to do more work to make that explicit and visible, I think, and also to help make sure that all the people who use our grades use them in the right way. Because if they're not if those subtle distinctions aren't properly understood, then there's a risk of bad things happening. I don't want anybody to be disincentivised from working in any school in the country. I think it's very important that everybody wants to work in the schools that most need them.
Thank you. That's all we have time for. I think that every time we see a new Ofsted HMCI, it's a bit like a new Doctor Who.
Tom, that's the best line yet.
No. The best line was calling you Cersei, which I thought was my main next part.
My teenagers were so happy.
We'll see what happens to Cersei in the next season. That's the King's Landing. But we are grateful for the fact that Amanda's come along and actually taking questions from the communities of educators which are out there, and I think that's a very, very healthy thing to see. Also very healthy to see the engagement with research and evidence and substantiating the judgments. So wonderful to see, and a big thank you please to Amanda.